The smoldering hearth of colonial dissent, the air in Boston, in the late autumn of 1774, tasted of salt, coal smoke, and a perpetual, low-boiling resentment. For Elias Thorne, a master cooper whose workshop abutted the North End docks, the taste was as familiar as the scent of fresh oak staves. At 35, Elias was a man built for labor, broad in the shoulder, with hands permanently stained by pitch and tannins, but his true strength was now being tested not by the bending of wood, but by the bending of wills. Elias's shop, Thorne & Sons Cooperage, was a hub of necessary humble business. Barrels for rum, molasses, fish, and cider, these were the lifeblood of the colony, and Elias ensured the lifeblood flowed. But lately the flow was poisoned by the scarlet coats of King George's soldiers. They marched with an arrogance that chipped away at the foundations of colonial self-respect. Each measured step a reminder that their prosperity was conditional, granted by a distant parliament that understood neither their sweat nor their soil. The simmering dissent Elias felt was not the fiery rhetoric of Sam Adams. At the Old South Meeting House, Elias rarely attended the raucous political gatherings. His dissent was quieter, more practical, focused on the empty coffers of his neighbors and the insolent stares of the customs officials. He held a deep, silent belief that a man who built his own house should own the right to live in it without a soldier's inspection or a tax dictated by a man he had never met. This quiet conviction was the smoldering ember beneath the hearth of his life. It was late afternoon when the bell above the shop door jingled, announcing not a customer, but a man named Silas Reed. Silas was a dock foreman, a man of the people, but with a sharp mind that kept him just outside the sphere of the elite merchants. He carried the familiar scent of tar and brackish water. "Elias," Silas said, his voice low, leaning against a stack of hickory hoops. "The governor's men confiscated the Sea Serpent's last shipment. Said the stamps were not properly affixed to the manifests. They're not just taxing the cargo, they're strangling the port." Elias paused his work, the heavy adze resting against the wood grain. He wiped his brow with the back of a leather-gloved hand. "Strangling us, Silas, is the point. They want us reliant on their charity, not our own enterprise." "It's more than charity now," Silas countered, his eyes darting toward the street. "Old man Hemlock from the bakery won't sell his bread to the troops anymore. Said they offered him shillings so thin they could read the newspaper through 'em. Now the regulars are demanding he take script written on flimsy paper signed by Hutchinson." Hemlock refused. "They seized his ovens this morning, the seizure of a baker's ovens." This was not a matter of maritime trade or theoretical taxation. This was the king's men stealing a man's livelihood, his ability to feed his family, right in the heart of his community. Elias felt the familiar heat of anger rising, but he forced it down, compressing it into a solid, manageable object, like a wooden keg awaiting iron bands. "The Sons of Liberty will make a great spectacle of this, I suppose," Elias said dryly, returning to his adze. Silas sighed, running a hand over his rough beard. "Spectacles don't bake bread, Elias, but they do draw attention. The question remains, where does your attention lie? You've been quiet, too quiet. The boys need men who can build things, not just talk about tearing them down." Elias drove the adze into the oak stave, the sound sharp and authoritative. "I build things that last, Silas. I build the things that hold our food and drink safe. That requires precision, not haste. And what good is a perfectly crafted barrel if the city it serves burns down around it?" Silas pressed. "We need you to think beyond this shop. There are whispers of a militia organizing outside the city limits. Men practicing with old hunting rifles, drilling under the cover of the woods. They need strong backs to haul ammunition, men who know how to measure twice and cut once. They need a quartermaster, Elias. They need a man who understands logistics." Elias stood up straight, the noise of the harbor suddenly seeming very loud. A quartermaster. It meant leaving the familiar scent of wood for the unknown smell of gunpowder. It meant exchanging the steady rhythm of the cooper's mallet for the unpredictable beat of war drums. His wife, Martha, always knew when the fire beneath his hearth was burning too hot. She entered from the back room, carrying a steaming mug of spiced cider, her expression a study in quiet concern. "Elias, you've missed supper again," she said, her tone gentle but firm. She placed the mug on his workbench, a brief moment of domestic warmth in the cold shop. Her eyes, however, were fixed on Silas. She understood the unspoken invitation hanging between the two men. "Silas was just offering me a position," Elias said, taking a long sip. Martha looked from Silas to the stacks of imported tea crates that lay abandoned by the pier, a silent monument to the Boston Tea Party months prior. "The last man who took up arms for liberty in our family, your own father, never saw his orchard again. Remember what you told our Thomas about the strength of wood. A single stave might split under pressure, but bound together the structure holds." This was the core of Elias's dilemma. He believed in the binding, the necessity of the colonies remaining united, but he feared the splitting that war surely brought. He saw the faces of his young sons, Thomas and James, who were growing up watching the king's troops in the streets, their innocence slowly being replaced by a hard, suspicious glint. "I hear you, Martha," Elias murmured. "But what if the binding itself is flawed? What if the structure is built on sand?" Silas stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "The foundation is flawed, Elias. The Parliament believes we are merely tenants. We know we are the owners. The choice is no longer about taxes on tea or paper. It is about who holds the hammer when it comes time to build the next structure. We are meeting tomorrow night, past the stone wall on Lexington Road. You must decide if you are building barrels for the king's garrison, or something new entirely." Silas placed a small folded slip of paper, rough, handmade, and distinctly not English issue, on the workbench beside the cider. It contained only a time and a location. Without another word, he nodded stiffly to Martha and slipped out the door, leaving Elias standing amidst the tools of his trade. Elias picked up the paper. The wood dust seemed to swirl around the slip, suddenly feeling heavier, charged with the weight of unspoken treason. He looked at the familiar tools, the drawknife, the bung auger, the stout iron hoops. He was a cooper, a shaper of vessels. Now, it seemed, he had to help shape a nation. He turned to Martha, his face grim. "The wind is changing, wife. The hearth fire is no longer enough. It's time to see if we can withstand the blast." When the drumbeat called men to arms, the small slip of paper Silas Reed had left on the workbench remained precisely where Elias had placed it, a defiant square of rough linen against the smooth, oiled surface of his bench. For 3 days, Elias had worked with a mechanical precision that betrayed the turmoil beneath. He measured, he shaved, he hammered iron hoops, yet every tap of the mallet felt muted, every line of the wood grain a map leading away from his cooperage. Martha moved around him like a shadow, her silence more potent than any lecture. Their eldest, Thomas, just 12, noticed the tension, mimicking his father's posture, gripping a wooden hoop as if it were a musket. On the third night, the sound came. It wasn't the familiar clang of the town bell warning of fire, nor the rhythmic marching of the king's patrols. It was a frantic, irregular rat-a-tat-tat, the urgent, unmistakable rhythm of a militia drum summoning men to immediate muster. It was the sound of theory becoming bloody reality. Elias dropped his tool, a heavy copper bung hammer, which hit the floor with a deafening clang. He stared at the offending object, momentarily paralyzed. Martha, who had been mending a seam by the flickering lamp, gasped, dropping her needlework. "That's not a drill," Silas's voice boomed from the open doorway, startling them both. He stood there, breathless, his face streaked with dirt and exertion, not tar. "That's the alarm. They've moved on, Hemlock." The regulars raided the bakery, seized the building, and arrested Hemlock and 3 others at the Old South Meeting House for seditious assembly. The Provincial Congress just issued the call. "They are heading for Concord. They are searching for weapons caches." The words landed like musket balls. Seizing the bakers' ovens was one thing. Seizing the political heart of the city and arresting leaders was an act of war, not governance. The smoldering dissent in Elias's hearth had finally ignited into flame. "Lexington," Elias breathed, remembering the rendezvous point from Silas's note. The decision, which had seemed agonizingly complex days before, was now brutally simple. To stay was to become an accessory to oppression. To go was to risk everything he loved. He looked at his young son, Thomas, who was standing behind Martha, his eyes wide but fixed on his father with an unnerving mixture of pride and terror. Elias felt a profound paternal duty to show the boy what a free man looked like, even if it meant leaving him in a time of danger. "Silas," Elias said, his voice ringing with a newfound steely resonance that surprised even himself. "Tell me what needs hauling, and I will find the strongest wagon in the North End. If the British confiscate it, I'll build them a new one when this is over." Silas let out a ragged breath that sounded like relief, mixed with grim acceptance. "Good man, Elias. The main stores are near Lincoln. It's a 6-hour ride if we push the horses. We need 2 wagons, well hidden. Can you find a second driver?" Elias didn't hesitate. He knew exactly whom to ask. Not a radical, but a man equally invested in the act of creation. He nodded toward the back of the shop. "Old man Hemlock's apprentice, young Peter. He has the strength, and now he has the reason. I'll fetch him." The next hour was a frenzy of focused action, the adrenaline washing away the anxiety. Elias ignored the whispers of his neighbors, who peered from their shadowed doorways, some with fearful judgment, others with quiet respect. He moved Hemlock's heavy wagon, usually reserved for molasses barrels, into the yard. He rapidly emptied his own shop of anything that could be mistaken for seditious literature or weapon caches, hiding the tools that might tempt a soldier's curiosity. He packed the wagon not with flour or wine, but with sacks of dried beans, rolls of linen for bandages, and most importantly, the tightly packed kegs of black powder they had covertly procured months before. When Peter arrived, his face was ashen, his hands shaking slightly as he saw the true cargo. He was a boy barely older than Thomas, thrust into manhood by the king's soldiers. "Mr. Thorne, Peter began, stammering. "No words, Peter," Elias cut him off, already tying the tarpaulin tight over the cargo. "Your master is in the hands of the governor. We are securing the supplies for the militia who will soon come to liberate him. Your duty is simple. Follow my lead, keep silent, and do not let the British see these hoops. They are holding our future hostage. We are holding their defeat in these barrels." As the town settled into a tense, unnatural quiet, the calm before the dawn of conflict, Elias kissed Martha on the forehead. A hard, quick gesture devoid of sentimentality but full of promise. He looked at his sons, standing together in the doorway, holding one another's hands. "I will return to build new things," he told them, his voice hoarse. "Do not let anyone take your mother's hearth while I am gone. And Thomas, remember the wood, strong only when bound together." With Silas taking the lead wagon and Elias guiding the second, laden with the colony's fragile supply of gunpowder, they slipped out of the North End just as the first hint of gray light touched the eastern sky. The town of Boston, the center of their world, was vanishing behind them, exchanged for the ominous, silent road leading west. The drum's urgent call had stopped, replaced by the steady, heavy creak of their wagon wheels, the sound of necessity rolling toward Lexington. The smoldering hearth was abandoned, and Elias Thorne, the cooper, had officially become a pioneer in a war he never wanted, but one he could no longer afford to ignore. Treason's whisper in the tavern. The road to Concord was not paved with patriotic fervor, but with mud, anxiety, and the persistent chill that seeped into the bones, regardless of one's conviction. For Elias Thorne and Peter, the journey was less a grand march and more a desperate race to safeguard vital supplies. They had successfully delivered the powder and bandages to the concealed hollow beneath a massive ancient elm, earning grim nods of thanks from the men waiting there, farmers and tradesmen, now wearing stained hunting shirts instead of rough-spun linen. Silas had gone on ahead with the advance riders, tasked with reconnaissance. Elias and Peter were left with the arduous task of backtracking, blending into the landscape, and waiting for the true storm to break. They found refuge in an unmarked way station, less a tavern and more a heavily fortified farmhouse owned by a man known only as Gideon, whose loyalty was as thick as the stone walls surrounding his property. The interior of Gideon's house was dark, lit only by the sputtering fire and a few tallow candles. The air was heavy with the smell of wood smoke, damp wool, and unwashed bodies. This was the quiet, dangerous nerve center of the Massachusetts militia, a place where revolutionary zeal was tempered by the stark reality of possible execution. "You are a Cooper," Gideon stated, looking Elias up and down. He was a giant of a man, his beard braided with leather thongs, his eyes missing nothing. "Your hands speak of honest work. Honest work is what buys the powder. But honest men often die first when the truth is demanded." Elias felt the familiar prickle of defensiveness, the instinct to retreat to the measurable certainty of his workshop. "I bind what needs binding, sir. Right now, that means keeping the king's men from using our stores against us." "Noble enough," Gideon conceded, sliding a chipped pewter mug of weak ale toward him. "But holding the supplies is just mechanics, Mr. Thorne. The next phase requires whispers." He leaned in, the candlelight catching the deep lines around his eyes. "The true battle isn't on the field tomorrow. It's in the intelligence we gather tonight. The British regulars believe they are marching to seize a few caches. They do not know their route is compromised, their supply lines anticipated, or that their own colonial friends have already turned informant." Elias instinctively flinched. He was a mechanic, a man of measurements and tangible goods. Espionage felt inherently dishonorable, a betrayal of the straightforward nature he prized. "I am no spy, Gideon. I am a supplier." "In this game, Mr. Thorne," Gideon said softly, "every man who carries news, every man who overhears a casual word, is a spy. You are an insider in the supply chain. The British know the merchants. They don't know the men who supply their very barracks with barrels for their salted beef and water." Gideon then laid out the task that shattered Elias's comfortable boundary between civilian life and rebellion. A key British officer, Major Alistair Finch, was known to frequent a specific tavern in Lexington Center, the King's Head, a loyalist haunt that remained operational despite the growing unrest. Finch was arrogant, prone to boastfulness when fortified by drink, and was rumored to be mapping out the Colonial militia. Positions near the North Bridge, the very positions Elias's supplies were meant to reinforce. "We need to know the precise number of men marching with him tomorrow, their objectives, and if they have any loyalist colonial guides embedded with them," Gideon explained. "Silas is too known by the patrol captains. Peter is too young to be trusted in such an environment. You, Mr. Thorne, are an unknown quantity to the Redcoats. You simply look like a farmer hauling goods away from the city chaos." The prospect made Elias's stomach clench. To walk into the enemy's den, order a drink, and listen for whispers, it felt less like bravery and more like suicide veiled in deceit. He thought of Martha and Thomas waiting back in Boston. If he were discovered, they would not just lose their property. They would hang as traitors' kin. "What if I refuse?" Elias asked, the words tasting like ash. Gideon fixed him with a stare that held no threat, only cold finality. "Then you are a man who built the means for one side to fight, but refuses to use your voice to ensure the other side loses. You become a dangerous liability to us, Mr. Thorne, because you know too much and refuse commitment. If you leave tonight, you are simply a man fleeing the city. If you stay and refuse to use the knowledge you have, you are betting your family's safety against the effectiveness of our intelligence. The whisper of treason isn't just what you say against the king. It's what you fail to say for the cause you've already armed." The logic was devastatingly sound, yet morally repugnant to Elias's nature. He wanted to build, to fix, to create order. Deception was the antithesis of his craft. He looked at Peter, who was staring into his ale mug, silently praying for a miracle that would send him back to his quiet apprenticeship. Elias knew he could not ask the boy to face this lie. The boy was a driver, not a whisper catcher. Elias took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. He thought of Hemlock's seized ovens. He thought of the necessity of that binding strength Martha had mentioned. If the structure was to hold, sometimes the most necessary tool was not the ads, but the lie. "Very well, Gideon," Elias said, pushing the pewter mug aside with a decisive scrape. "Tell me everything you know about Major Finch. Tell me his favorite drink, his favorite topic of conversation, and the exact layout of the King's Head. I will go in as Elias Thorne, Cooper, escaping the city before the fighting starts. I will listen for the whispers. Gideon broke into a rare, thin smile. The man has a taste for French brandy, 2 fingers neat, and he complains incessantly about the quality of the Colonial horses. He believes this rebellion will be over by Christmas. You'll find him in the corner booth near the hearth, seeking warmth. Be cautious, Cooper. A lie told well sounds just like the truth. Elias stood up, feeling the familiar ache in his back, but now overlaid with a sharp electric tension. He was no longer just supplying the war. He was walking directly into its mouth, armed only with the guise of an honest tradesman and the terrible weight of a necessary lie. Winter on the march. Valley Forge's shadow, the intelligence Elias Thorne provided at the Lexington rendezvous, proved vital, though the cost was immediate and high. The powder was deployed just in time, and Major Finch's contingent marched directly into a well-set ambush near the North Bridge, suffering heavy losses before the main engagement even began. Elias never saw the fight. His role was logistics, not musketry. He and Peter, having escaped back toward the safety of the countryside, were immediately absorbed into the nascent, desperate infrastructure of the Continental Army. The initial rush of patriotic adrenaline faded quickly, replaced by the relentless, soul-crushing reality of the winter of 1777 to 1778. They were not in Lexington anymore. They were deep in Pennsylvania, at the sprawling, frozen nightmare that was Valley Forge. Elias, the master cooper, found his skill tragically indispensable. The army, for all its bravery, was crumbling not from British bayonets, but from rot, hunger, and the failure of supply lines he had once tried to manage from afar. He was now immersed in the chaos he had feared. These barrels, he muttered to Peter one frigid morning, standing ankle-deep in frozen mud that threatened to swallow his boots whole. These are the enemy now. They leak, they crack, they harbor disease. The army required countless containers for salted beef that spoiled before it could be eaten, for clean drinking water that froze before it reached the troops, and for the rancid tallow used in poorly made candles that sputtered and died. Elias's previous precision now felt like a cruel joke. He was working with wood so green it wept sap, iron hoops so brittle they snapped in the slightest frost, and in constant competition with hungry soldiers willing to burn a barrel for a few minutes of heat. His grand title, Quartermaster's Assistant for Liquid Stores, sounded impressive, but it meant endless, grinding inventory disputes in tents, barely offering shelter from the biting wind. The true shadow of Valley Forge was not the British Army, but scurvy and despair. Elias constantly battled the officers demanding provisions and the depleted, freezing men who had nothing to offer in return but their loyalty, which often seemed thin as watered-down rum. One afternoon, huddled in his makeshift office, a canvas tent perpetually sagging under a coating of ice, Elias was confronted by a grizzled sergeant named Macready, whose uniform was little more than rags stitched together with twine. "Mr. Thorne," Macready rasped, his breath instantly crystallizing. "We need 3 dozen containers for sauerkraut brine. General Washington himself signed the requisition. We need it to fight the sickness." Elias slammed a ledger shut. "Sergeant, I have 3 dozen half-rotted casks designated for water, and the iron bands are rusting through faster than I can hammer them tight. The wood splits if you breathe on it wrong. Where do you expect me to find sound oak, seasoned? For 12 months? In the middle of a war zone in February?" "I expect you to find it because the general expects it," Macready shot back, his voice cracking with fatigue. "If you can turn green oak into a watertight vessel that lasts a week, you do it. Because the men who made this march here are dying slower than if they were under fire. A soldier dies once in battle. He dies 1,000 times in this mud." The sergeant's words hit Elias harder than any philosophical argument. He had been so focused on the principle of resistance that he had forgotten the tangible, agonizing reality of the men doing the fighting. His smoldering hearth was now a raging, desperate struggle for basic survival. That evening, Elias gathered Peter and a handful of captured laborers who were too injured for combat but strong enough to swing a hammer. He abandoned the king's standards of aging timber. "We change the method," Elias announced over the wind. "We cannot season the wood. We will use it green, but we will treat it differently." He remembered a technique his grandfather used for storing brackish river water, a crude, temporary method. He instructed them to boil the wood, not dry it, but boil it in heated salt water mixed with pine resin. This process, though time-consuming, helped the green wood swell and seal faster, offering a temporary reprieve from leakage. It was an engineering compromise, a way to build something just good enough to last the critical duration, a concept alien to his perfectionist nature. For 3 grueling weeks, Elias drove them relentlessly. He ignored his own hunger, subsisting on hard biscuits and thin broth, his body aching from the cold and the sheer physical exertion of forcing imperfect materials into the shape of utility. He became a living embodiment of the army's struggle, making do with what was at hand, sacrificing quality for immediate necessity. One day, a courier arrived from the general's headquarters, a young, sharp-eyed aide. He found Elias overseeing the application of tar to a new batch of water barrels. "Mr. Thorne," the aide said, shivering despite his fine wool coat, "your requisition reports for the last month have been remarkable. The water contamination reports are down 40%. The men are calling your new brine casks the Thorne tubs. You have saved lives through your stubbornness, sir." Elias felt a flicker of the old pride, but it was instantly tempered by the grim scene around him. "Tell the general thank you, son, but tell him that a barrel built in a fortnight with green wood will not last the campaign. If we do not secure better timber by spring, these tubs will fall apart before the first major engagement." "The general knows, Mr. Thorne," the aide replied seriously. "But you have bought us time. Time to survive until spring. That is often the greatest victory." As the aide rode off, Elias leaned against a stack of finished tubs, their wood still steaming faintly from the resin bath. He was no longer merely a cooper, he was a logistical lifeline in a desperate situation. He hadn't fired a shot, but he was fighting the war on a different front, the one against starvation, disease, and bureaucratic collapse. The shadow of Valley Forge, the shadow of near defeat, was long, but Elias Thorne, the man who used to measure his life in the perfect curve of an oak stave, was now measuring it in saved lives, one imperfectly constructed barrel at a time. A bridge of trust. Across enemy lines, by the spring of 1778, the Continental Army was reborn, not through victory, but through sheer stubborn endurance at Valley Forge. The arrival of the Prussian officer Baron von Steuben brought discipline, and the French alliance brought hope. Yet the fundamental problem of logistics, the reliable flow of supplies, remained Elias Thorne's daily agony. His Thorne tubs, though they saved lives, were temporary fixes. The Army desperately needed solid intelligence on the location of nearby, untapped British supply depots if they were to survive the coming summer campaign. Elias's reputation as a man who could build a functional vessel from flawed materials had reached the highest ranks. One rainy evening, he was summoned from his waterlogged tent to the headquarters of a colonel, a stern but pragmatic man who had overseen his work. "Thorne," the colonel began, his voice low and serious, "your reports on the quality of our preserved stores are grim, and your assessment that we cannot sustain a campaign without fresh supplies is tragically accurate. We are not fighting an army, we are fighting the king's endless stockpiles." "And the king's casks don't leak, Colonel," Elias replied bitterly. "Indeed, but the king's supply chain is long. It passes through loyalist territories, guarded not by regulars, but by men who prefer to be paid in gold, not principal," the colonel revealed, sliding a hastily drawn map across the desk. The map highlighted a sparsely populated area in the New Jersey Pine Barrens, a region known to harbor both neutral Quakers and ruthless bandit gangs. But critically, It also marked a covert royalist supply line. We believe a major cache, rum, flour, muskets, perhaps even good oak timber, is being stored at a defunct mill 3 days east of here, the colonel explained. It is guarded by a small contingent of German Hessian mercenaries and overseen by a local loyalist merchant, Mr. Josiah Caldwell. Caldwell is known for his avarice, but he is fiercely protected by a group of Native American trackers from the local Lenape tribe, whose loyalty he bought with regular exclusive trading rights. This was the true danger. The Hessians were professional fighters, but the Lenape trackers knew the land intimately. No frontal assault could succeed. We need the supplies, Thorne, but we cannot afford to lose men fighting the tribe. We need a bridge of trust across enemy lines, the colonel stated, looking directly into Elias's eyes. And you believe I can build it? Elias asked, an old cold fear returning. He was a tradesman, not a diplomat. You built trust with men who were literally starving to death at Valley Forge. Caldwell is a merchant. He speaks the language of trade. The Lenape are practical. They speak the language of survival. You, a cooper, deal in goods that sustain life. You will go in with a small, convincing offer of trade, an exchange that looks like a private loyalist transaction. We need you to speak to the Lenape scout leader, a man named Kitchie, before you approach Caldwell. Kitchie has been used by Caldwell, not respected. Elias felt the old pressure of the deception he first executed in the tavern. He hated the lie, but the desperation of the army was a powerful motivator. He set out before dawn with Peter and 2 pack horses laden not with powder, but with tools of his trade. A few exquisite, finished oak staves, some fine iron bands salvaged from a captured British wagon, and a small, carefully sealed cask of high-quality molasses, a rare and valuable commodity. After 3 days of tense travel through the wilderness, guided by the colonel's sketchy map, they found the isolated mill. It was a dark, forbidding structure, ringed by Hessian sentries, but Elias ignored them. He focused on the tree line, knowing the Lenape would see them long before he saw them. He stopped the horses, dismounted, and waited, ignoring Peter's anxious whispers. He then did something entirely unexpected. He began to work. He pulled out the finest oak stave and a draw knife, and began shaping the wood with the focused, rhythmic movements of his trade. He wasn't building a weapon. He was building proof of his skill. Within minutes, a figure emerged silently from the pines. Kitchie. He was a man of serious gaze and intimidating stillness, clad in deerskin. He carried an old French musket. Kitchie watched Elias work. His eyes narrowed, then focused on the small sealed cask of molasses on the pack horse. Elias did not rise or speak. He simply finished shaping the stave, held it up for Kitchie to see its flawless curve, and then, using gestures, offered the molasses. Kitchie remained motionless for a long moment, then slowly approached. He took the cask, inspected the quality of the wood, Elias had built it, and then broke the seal. He tasted the thick, sweet syrup. It was the purest molasses Elias could secure, a luxury Caldwell would never waste on native traders. Finally, Kitchie spoke, his voice a low, gravelly baritone in halting English. White man brings gift, but his eyes bring lies. You are not for the king. Elias set down his tool. I am for survival, Kitchie. I am a builder of casks. Caldwell pays you in iron and promises. He gives you spoiled goods in my shoddy barrels. I offer you this molasses made in Boston pure. I offer you honest trade and the choice of better futures for your people. Caldwell will take your land when the king has won. Elias explained that the supplies inside the mill were perishable, and that if Kitchie and his men were willing to simply step away for one night, the supplies would vanish, preventing the British from using them to defeat the Colonials, thus hastening the end of the conflict and preventing further land claims. Kitchie studied Elias, assessing the cooper's rough sincerity against the typical deceit of colonial merchants. Elias didn't ask Kitchie to fight. He asked him to make a practical choice between a known, greedy liar and an honest builder offering pure goods. "If I turn from Caldwell," Kitchie finally said, "my men lose their pay, and we are enemies of the king." "You are already enemies of Caldwell's honesty," Elias countered. "Your loyalty is bought with the promise of spoiled meat and shoddy cloth. I offer you a future where men like Caldwell lose, and men who honor trade win." He pointed to the perfect stave he had finished. "I build things that hold. Caldwell promises things that vanish." Kitchie nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the empty space beyond the mill's perimeter. He had endured Caldwell's broken promises for too long. He looked at the purity of the molasses, a stark contrast to the greed of the loyalist merchant. "The Hessians are relieved at midnight," Kitchie finally whispered. "For 1 hour the wind will move south. You must be silent as the snow." Elias did not shake his hand or thank him. He simply bowed his head in a gesture of profound respect. The bridge was built, not with wood, but with the shared language of integrity and the lure of pure, uncompromised trade. The destiny of the supplies, and possibly the campaign, now rested on the fragile trust between a New England cooper and a Lenape scout. The cost of defiance at Yorktown, the victory at the mill in 1778, engineered through Elias Thorne's improvised diplomacy and Kitchie's silent betrayal of the loyalist Caldwell, was pivotal. The captured British stores, fresh flour, rum, and critically enough quality oak to forge 200 new casks, had sustained the Continental Army through a brutal winter. Elias was hailed not as a hero, but as an indispensable man. He was swiftly promoted from simple cooper to master logistician, his keen eye for efficiency and his uncompromising standard for materials now applied to the grand, complex machinations of the war effort. The subsequent 3 years blurred into a relentless campaign of movement and supply, linking the American forces with the newly arrived French allies. Elias found himself dealing less with wood and iron, and more with charts, manifests, and the arrogant, precise demands of the French engineers who treated him, the tradesman, with a curious mix of disdain and respect. By the late summer of 1781, all paths converged to the swampy, sweltering peninsula of Virginia, Yorktown. Elias stood on the edge of the newly dug parallel, the atmosphere thick with the smell of turned earth, salt marsh, and nervous sweat. He was no longer the young man of 76. His face was etched with 3 years of sleepless nights and moral compromises. His hands, though still capable, now gripped a spyglass and an annotated map more often than a howl. He was here to ensure the Franco-American lines, now stretching in a crescent around Lord Cornwallis's trapped army, remained functional, supplied, and most importantly, dry. His primary task, coordinating the movement of the heavy French siege artillery and securing the freshwater cisterns from the contamination of the British lines. A massive storm front was rolling in from the coast, threatening to turn the trenches into mud pits and, worse, soak the irreplaceable gunpowder stores. Beside him, however, was his constant, Peter. Peter was no longer a boy, but a hardened soldier. He had volunteered for the engineering corps, but insisted on remaining Elias's chief runner and right-hand man, valuing the trust of the cooper over the rigidity of military rank. "The first line is secured." "Elias," Peter reported, his voice tight from exertion. "The French engineers insist their powder is triple-cased, but I saw one cask, an old pine thing, rattling loose. I marked it. Needs Thorne attention." Elias lowered his spyglass, looking at the British position. The defiant redcoats were silent, an unnatural, unsettling calm before the storm. "Rattling loose means rotting powder, Peter. Go back. Tell them to double the canvas, then report to the commander about the fresh water supply. The tide is turning fast. We need to pull the wagons back before the marsh claims them." Peter grinned, a flash of white in the dirt. "Right. 1 loose cask, and then I'm off to save us from the salt water." He paused, then his expression shifted to concern. "It's too quiet, Elias. This is the cost of defiance, isn't it?" "Not the fighting, but the waiting for the debt to be called in." "It is," Elias agreed, his gaze fixed on the British lines. "Now go!" Peter sprinted toward the rear. Elias turned back to supervise the movement of a massive 24-pounder cannon when the stillness broke. It wasn't a roar, but a sharp, high whistle, followed instantly by the deafening thud of a British mortar shell hitting the ground just behind the main earthworks. Elias dove into a newly dug ditch, his ears ringing as shrapnel tore through the air above. He waited for the echoes to fade, then scrambled back up, tasting dust and fear. The shell had impacted near the transport staging area, the same path Peter had just taken. He ran, ignoring the shouts of officers trying to maintain order. He reached the blast site. The chaos was immediate, brutal. A wagon lay overturned, an artillery mule screamed, and several men lay still. He spotted the broken, familiar form of his apprentice beside the shattered remnants of the old pine cask. Peter was alive, but barely, his right leg pinned and mangled by a piece of shrapnel from the carriage axle. "Peter!" Elias shouted, rushing forward. Peter looked up, his face pale and slick with blood, but a grim lucidity remained in his eyes. He tried to speak, but only a gasp escaped. He pointed a trembling, blood-soaked finger toward the marsh, where the main gunpowder cache, hundreds of barrels, was being exposed to the rapidly rising storm surge. "Water, powder," Peter whispered, before his head fell back against the damp earth. The cost of defiance was paid not with a strategic loss, but with the body of the boy who trusted him, right at the moment of victory. Elias was paralyzed for a single agonizing moment, caught between saving his friend and saving the entire siege effort. The choice, though horrific, was clear. Peter had pointed to the mission, not to himself. Elias tore his own shirt into strips, creating a hasty tourniquet around Peter's upper thigh to slow the catastrophic bleeding. He yelled for a nearby French medic, shoving the man toward Peter's pinned body with a desperate command in broken French. "Sauvez-le! Vite! Save him! Quickly!" Then, running on pure adrenaline and the cold, focused precision that always came in moments of crisis, Elias sprinted toward the marsh. The situation was worse than he imagined. The first heavy bands of rain had begun to fall, and the tide had turned, seeping into the hastily dug powder pits. The French engineers, overly confident in their European designs, had used wooden planks for the floor of the temporary magazine, planks that were now floating. If the water reached the barrels, the entire reserve could be ruined, or worse, trigger a catastrophic explosion. Elias had minutes. He knew he couldn't move the barrels, but he knew water. He knew how to defeat it. He spotted the solution: a dozen empty, discarded thorn tubs, his own design from years ago, once used for storing molasses and now repurposed for hauling waste. They were useless for holding powder, but perfect for diverting water. Elias seized the nearest axe and, shouting for the stunned, demoralized soldiers to assist, he began chopping. He and the men worked with a frenzy born of desperation, splitting the barrels and rapidly arranging the staves into a series of hasty, interlocking weirs, low walls designed to divert the flow of groundwater and the incoming tide from the main storage pit. He ordered men to shovel mud and sand into the gaps, creating a rudimentary dam. He was soaked, his muscles screaming, but the image of Peter's face, still pointing to the mission, fueled him. He was no longer fighting for Congress or king. He was fighting for Peter's sacrifice to mean something more than a mangled limb. Just as the tide reached the lip of the dam, holding back the corrosive salt water by inches, the sound of the assault began. It was not the roar of cannon, but the sharp, frantic crackle of musketry and the terrifying scream of men charging the British lines. This was the moment, the cost of defiance being paid in full. In the distance, through the rain and smoke, Elias could just make out the furious, focused assault on Redoubt 10, led by Alexander Hamilton himself. The American troops, emboldened by their desperate position and the French support, refused to wait. They charged with fixed bayonets, a terrifying, silent wave of pure fury. The siege cannon, now protected by Elias's crude dam, began to fire with measured, earth-shaking rhythm. The defiance of the siege, the 3 years of struggle, the entire war, it all climaxed in that 30-minute explosion of violence. When the musketry finally ceased, replaced by the victorious, raw cheers of the Continental soldiers, Elias sank back onto the muddy ground, exhausted. He was alive. The powder was dry. The trenches were safe. The siege was won. A few hours later, in the pale, misty dawn, the news arrived. Cornwallis had surrendered. The celebrations were deafening, but Elias stood apart, leaning against the makeshift dam he had built. He found Peter in a field hospital, unconscious, feverish, but stabilized. The medic confirmed the amputation of the leg. Peter would live, but he would walk no more. Elias walked out to the field, now strangely quiet, and picked up a piece of the shattered pine cask that had cost Peter his leg. He turned the broken wood over and over in his hands. The defiance had succeeded. The new nation was born. But the cost was real, permanent, and personal. It wasn't just the millions of pounds in debt or the thousands of unknown dead. It was the future of his loyal apprentice, Peter. It was the purity of Kitchy's trust, stained by war. It was the part of Elias, the honest cooper, who had learned to lie, manipulate, and endure loss for the sake of an abstract idea called freedom. He realized the true cost of defiance was not what they lost, but how they had to live with what remained. He was a master logician of the new republic, but he would forever be bound to the ghost of a boy who only wanted to run freely on his own 2 feet. He had built a nation, but in the process, he had broken his own heart piece by piece, like the staves of a shattered barrel. The silence after the cannon fire. The musketry ceased at Yorktown, not with a gradual taper, but an abrupt, unnerving silence. It was a vacuum of sound that sucked the tension out of the air, leaving behind only the ringing in Elias Thorne's ears, the distant mournful cries of the injured, and the sickening smell of spent gunpowder and blood-soaked earth. On the morning of October 19, 1781, Elias stood on the main parallel watching the British surrender ceremony. It was a magnificent spectacle of defiance and triumph. The Continental and French armies lined up in sharp, victorious formation, the scarlet columns of the defeated marching out to the mournful tune of "The World Turned Upside Down." But Elias saw none of the glory. He did not cheer or clap. He saw only the endless muddy columns of men who would never march the same way again, their uniforms torn, their faces empty. He was focused on one wagon. It was a sturdy, well-built vehicle, not one of his hastily constructed tubs, but a proper, reliable transport wagon that was now acting as an ambulance. Inside lay Peter, his former apprentice, pale as the driven snow, his breathing shallow. Elias had secured him the best medical attention available, a French surgeon named Dr. Moreau, who was more accustomed to treating the nobility than colonial logistics runners. "He will live, Monsieur Thorne," Moreau had confirmed that morning, his French accent thick with exhaustion. "But the gangrene. We had to take the leg high. He is strong, yes, but the spirit, c'est une autre affaire. That is another matter. He has paid a terrible price for your victory." The word price echoed in Elias's mind, a constant, sharp sound in the profound silence. He walked alongside the slow-moving wagon, holding a small, smooth piece of mahogany, a fragment from the shattered pine cask that had cost Peter his limb. He was the master of logistics, the man who had protected the powder, yet he had failed the one person who trusted him implicitly. He had fulfilled the mission. The supplies were secure. The siege was won. But the cost was being carried away in this wagon, alive but fundamentally broken. They traveled north toward a small, established military hospital near Williamsburg. The journey took a day, and Elias used every minute to confront the stark, uncomfortable truth of his choices. He was lauded by the officers for his resourcefulness. Colonel Hamilton himself had shaken his hand, praising the dam built of barrels that saved the powder. Yet Elias felt like a profound failure. He had traded a life's ambition, perfect, enduring casks for survival, temporary, necessary fixes, and traded his apprentice's future for a fragile, abstract concept called the Republic. That evening in the quiet, sterile for a wartime hospital air of the recovery ward, Peter awoke. His eyes, though unfocused, found Elias immediately. "The powder," Peter whispered, his voice thin as a thread. "It did not get wet, Mr. Thorne?" Elias sat on the stool beside the cot, the piece of mahogany resting in his palm. He had prepared a speech, words of comfort, promise, and gratitude. All of it fled. It was dry, Peter, Elias said simply, his voice cracking. It was perfectly dry. You did your duty. Peter managed a faint, satisfied smile that instantly faded into a grimace of pain. The king's gold. It's not worth a full night's sleep, is it? Better to pay with this. He gestured weakly to the mound beneath the linen sheet. No, Elias interrupted, his voice rough. It was not right. You should not have been there. It was my miscalculation, my failure to ensure that pine was properly secured. I was too slow. You paid the price for my oversight. Peter shook his head slowly. No, Mr. Thorne, you taught me about the wood. You taught me the stave must be cut away if it threatens the whole cask. I was the flawed stave, but I saved the structure. I made the choice, sir. I pointed at the powder. I chose the Republic over my running. He paused, taking a painful breath. Will you take me back to Boston? I want to see the docks again, and I want to teach Thomas how to find the grain in the wood. The true test of the Republic was not whether it could win a war, but whether it could honor the sacrifice of those who built it. Elias, the man who knew how to bind broken things, understood what he must do. We will go home, Peter, Elias pledged, the mahogany warming in his hand. And you will never pay another shilling for a roof or a meal. You will be a partner in Thorne & Sons. You will teach Thomas everything you know, because you are the strongest man I have ever known. The new Republic will be built not by the generals, but by the men like you who paid the price to keep the powder dry. I swear it. Elias stayed in Williamsburg for 2 weeks, personally supervising Peter's care. He wrote a long, heartfelt letter to Martha, his words stripped of the coded military jargon he had learned, filled only with the simple truth of Peter's sacrifice and his own grief. He described the terrible beauty of the final, decisive silence, a silence that felt heavier and more profound than any cannon fire. When they finally loaded the custom-built, cushioned wagon for the long journey north, Elias looked at the site of the siege. It was already fading, becoming an overgrown scar on the landscape. The mud was drying, the trenches were being filled, and the cannons were being carted away. All that remained were the stories and the permanent, physical changes in the men who survived. As they passed the line of weary, victorious soldiers heading home, Elias felt a strange mix of pride and profound emptiness. He had helped create a nation, but the nation he created was not the pure, unblemished ideal he had imagined in his quiet cooperage years ago. It was a nation born of necessity, compromised by lies, and eternally indebted to the physical and moral wounds of men like Peter. The silence after the cannon fire was not the silence of peace, but the quiet, heavy silence of reckoning. The war was over, but the debt was just beginning. Elias, the master cooper, understood his final role. He was not a soldier, but a custodian of sacrifice. His new job was to ensure that the binding, the unity, of the new Republic was strong enough to support the great weight of the price paid at Yorktown. Pledging the future to an unfinished Republic, the journey north from Yorktown was slow, a months-long passage that mirrored the arduous birth of the Republic itself. Elias Thorne did not return a triumphant hero, but a man burdened by the weight of necessary compromises and solemn promises. He arrived back in Boston in the spring of 1782, a master logistician retired to his meager cooperage, his grand military charts replaced by the familiar simplicity of his old work ledger. With him he brought Peter, alive, walking on a skillfully crafted wooden crutch, his spirit scarred but unbroken. The city had changed. The redcoats were gone, their garrisons abandoned, but the joy was brittle. The silence after the cannon fire was not a peaceful quiet, but a tense, anxious pause. The economy was shattered, the docks were stagnant, and the paper money, the currency of the revolution, was nearly worthless. Martha, aged by 3 years of worry, embraced Elias with a ferocious strength that belied her gentle nature. She shed no tears. She only looked at Peter, then at Elias, a silent, profound understanding passing between husband and wife about the hidden cost of the victory. Their eldest, Thomas, now a wiry, thoughtful teenager, stood taller, having been the man of the house during the war. Elias kept his promise. He immediately renamed his business Thorne & Sons Cooperage and Reed, making Peter a partner in all but law, a fact that eased Peter's immediate burden of shame. He paid for Peter's care and recovery out of his meager military scrip and the few coins he'd salvaged. But true reconstruction, Elias quickly realized, was not about balancing ledgers. It was about forging a common purpose from fractured ideals. The new republic was fundamentally unfinished. States argued over borders, currency, and debt. The very binding he had sought during the war, the unity of the 13 colonies, was fraying in the peace. One evening, Silas Reed, his face now worn by local politics, visited the cooperage. He found Elias not in his office, but back at the workbench, carefully selecting staves. "The Congress is a mess, Elias," Silas sighed, leaning against a half-finished wine barrel. "The grand dream of '76 is dissolving into squabbling. We fought a king, only to be ruled by 13 little kings. The merchants are hoarding gold. The farmers are defaulting on loans. The people are losing faith in this union." Elias paused his work, holding 2 oak staves up to the light. One was perfect, the other knotty and prone to splitting. "The structure is not yet built to last, Silas. We made a glorious roof, but the foundation remains shaky. And you, the great quartermaster of the revolution, are back to making cider barrels?" Silas asked, a touch of accusation in his voice. Elias smiled faintly. "No, Silas, I am back to making proof of concept. I learned something at Valley Forge. You cannot build a nation on borrowed virtue. You must build it on hard, honest work and practical solutions." Elias dedicated himself not to politics, but to economic stability. He realized that the revolution hadn't just been won by bullets. It was secured by the ability to move goods, flour, rum, and provisions. He began tirelessly campaigning among his fellow Boston tradesmen for a uniform system of measurement and credit, using the one thing they all understood: the barrel standard. If a Massachusetts barrel of fish is accepted as the exact same volume and quality as a South Carolina barrel of rice, Elias argued at a town meeting, then trust is established. Trade flows. When trade flows, the economy stabilizes. When the economy stabilizes, the republic can stand. He and Peter, drawing on their logistical knowledge, became evangelists for this economic unity. Peter, despite his injury, was an asset. His presence, a walking testament to the war's personal cost, silenced cynics faster than any argument. He taught Thomas the art of grading wood, of spotting flaws not as defects, but as challenges to be managed. "See this knot, Thomas?" Peter would instruct, tapping the knotty stave with his crutch. "This is a flaw. It will crack if you put pressure on it alone. But if you position it right near a strong hoop and surround it with perfect staves, the integrity of the whole structure protects the flaw. That is the republic, Thomas. It's not about being perfect. It's about holding the imperfections safe." Thomas, watching Peter's resilience, absorbed the lesson far deeper than any book on philosophy could teach. Elias's efforts, slow and painstaking, bore fruit. His standardized thorn measure for casks became informally accepted across the region, a commercial bridge that crossed the same state lines where politicians were still fighting. It was practical, tangible patriotism. In the midst of this work, in 1787, a new constitution was drafted, aiming to finally bind the states together with a centralized federal government. Elias received a letter from his old colonel, now a delegate, urging him to come to Philadelphia to speak to the delegates about the practicality of a unified economy. Elias refused the political call. He sent Peter and Thomas in his stead, entrusting them with the legacy of his struggle. "Go," Elias told them, handing Peter a small, perfectly crafted miniature cask, a symbol of the ideal. "Go to the men who write the law. Do not tell them about battles. Tell them about broken bodies and honest wood. Tell them the republic is an empty cask right now, waiting to be filled. They must ensure the hoops, the laws, are strong enough to hold the pressure of the people's ambition and the weight of our shared sacrifice." Peter and Thomas left for Philadelphia. When they returned, they carried with them not only stories of the great debates, but a reinforced sense of their own purpose. They had spoken to delegates, not as soldiers or merchants, but as men who had witnessed the cost of defiance and were pledging the future to ensure the sacrifice was worthwhile. Elias Thorne never again left his cooperage for a battlefield or a political arena. He remained the custodian of sacrifice, teaching his sons, and through them, the next generation of American tradesmen, that the true work of citizenship was not done with dramatic speeches or grand pronouncements, but with integrity, diligence, and the simple, humble dedication to making things that endure. He watched Thomas grow into a man who understood that a nation, like a barrel, required every piece to be flawless and bound together with unrelenting strength. He watched Peter, the wounded veteran, become the quiet, moral core of the business. One evening, years later, watching the sun set over the now bustling, prosperous docks of Boston, Elias sat with Martha. He looked at the perfect strong union of the staves on a newly finished cask, the republic of wood he had created. "It is finished, Martha," Elias murmured, referring not to the barrel, but to the long struggle. Martha placed her hand on his. "No, Elias, it is not finished. That is the point. It is an unfinished republic, and our pledge is to keep building it day by day until we are gone. And then Thomas and Peter will take up the hammer." Elias Thorne, the master cooper who became a reluctant revolutionary, finally understood. His life had not been a series of temporary fixes, but a continuous grinding act of creation. The legacy was not in the great victory, but in the small daily pledge to ensure that the binding would hold for the future. The war was over, but the building of America had just begun.